Hello, in this video we are going to be looking at Hume's Empiricism, which essentially follows on from John Locke's Empiricism that I looked at in the previous video. Let's just remind ourselves a little bit about what Locke was talking about. So to begin with, Locke suggested that our ideas are formed from experiencing the external world. So remember, he believed that we were born, the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa at birth, and that through repeated experiences our mind recognises the same experience twice and more than that, and forms an idea from that, a simple idea from that, such as red, for example. So the concept of red, Locke believes, is derived from the kind of experience we have when we encounter it. Right? But he never makes any distinction between when we encounter it and when we talk about it in the abstract. And in fact, it looks like he's suggesting that when we talk about the concept of red in the abstract, let's say we're talking about the colour red to someone, but we're not actually looking at an example of it, he believes that when that is occurring, we're actually having some sort of memory of the experience that we had that first formed that idea in our mind. Okay? Now, that's not always so, I don't think anyway. I mean, I certainly, when I'm talking about red in the abstract, don't always have a particular image of red in my mind when I'm doing so. All right. Now, Locke does seem to be committed to this idea that we have the same experience when we talk about it, but are not encountering it, as when we actually encounter it. All right. And he seems to be suggesting that remembering the experience is enough to apply the concept. But since the experience is not the concept, how can this be so? Right? There's a distinction between the experience of red and the concept of red. All right? And Locke doesn't seem to quite make that distinction fully. Now, Hume comes along and he essentially agrees with Locke. He likes Locke's empiricism, but he can see one or two problems with the way that Locke has developed his theory. And Hume essentially says we can divide our experiences from the concepts that we use to describe them. Right? Since experience and the application of a simple idea such as colour are different things, we need to be able to do that. Right? So Hume basically creates the distinction between what he calls impressions and ideas. Right? So the impressions are essentially the experiences and the ideas are the concepts themselves. Right? An impression, Hume believes, is the immediate vivacious experience. That's how he puts it. For example, seeing the colour red is a kind of immediate sense experience. The idea that the mind derives from these repeated experiences is a facsimile. It's a facsimile of the impression. Right? It's a vague copy. So, like Locke, Hume believed that these experiences were at the foundation of our conceptual schemes, if you like, our ideas and how we understand the world, but he's just basically putting a few finishing touches to Locke's theory where he saw that there might be some potential problems. Okay, so he develops this distinction between impressions and ideas. Impressions being the immediate vivacious experience, the quality of the experience, and the idea being a facsimile that is sort of derived from that impression. So with that in mind, let's now move to look at a fundamental aspect of Hume's empiricism. And this is known as Hume's fork. And it's basically the division of relations of ideas and matters of fact. All right? And this is how Hume explains that whilst it is possible to have a priori knowledge, that is, knowledge that is gained independently of experience, this knowledge is nothing but trivial and ultimately still rests on a posteriori knowledge, i.e. knowledge gained after experience. So, Hume's fork basically can be thought of as going in two directions. The first prong is that of relations of ideas, and the second prong is that of matters of fact. Right? Now, relations of ideas can be known a priori, that is, independently of experience, by examining the internal relations between our ideas. So these basically amount to analytic propositions. All right? And at this point, I think it's good to make a distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. So an analytic proposition is one in which what is known as the predicate is contained within the subject. So, for example, a triangle has three sides. Has three sides is the predicate, and it is contained within the concept of a triangle. Okay? And a predicate, just so you're clear, is something about the subject of a sentence. So in this case, has three sides is something about the subject's triangle. But as we can see, has three sides is internal to the concept of triangle. It contains that idea already. Right? So an analytic proposition in this sense does not tell us anything substantial about the world. By contrast, a synthetic proposition is one in which the predicate adds something to our knowledge of the subject. For example, the door is brown tells us something additional about the door. All right? So is brown in this case is the predicate, and it adds something to our knowledge of the door. Whereas has three sides does not add anything to our knowledge of a triangle. All right? Now for Hume, all knowledge is ultimately synthetic as it comes from experience. Right? We cannot know, for example, that the door is brown without experience. Now, when it comes to analytic propositions, Hume goes back to Locke's theory of ideas, which is that a triangle has to be experienced in the first instance before we can understand that a triangle is actually a three-sided figure. All right. So let's say that you are learning, and let's say you're 3 or 4, and you're just finding out what a triangle is, and someone said, your teacher says to you, well, a triangle has three sides, right? In that particular context, that's a new bit of information, right? So in that particular context, has three sides is not internal to the concept of triangle because you haven't understood what it is yet, right? But once you have understood what it is, then through combining ideas in a particular way, you can just show that, a triangle has three sides is analytically true because you know that a triangle is by definition a three-sided figure. All right. So this is the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. Now, relations of ideas do also contain necessary propositions that are not necessarily analytic. We'll come to that in just a moment, but I do just want to make sure that you are clear on the distinction here between analytic and synthetic propositions first. So Hume thought that relations of ideas could be grasped in two ways. The first is using your immediate intuition. So, for example, you don't have to work out that 2 + 2 = 4. You just intuitively know that because you're so used to doing it. Or that a square has 4 sides, right? You know that a square has 4 sides. You know that 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need to work these things out, right? You know them almost without thinking about it, except when you're learning, okay? In more complex cases, let's say you were dealing with a much more complex mathematical problem, all right? You would have to do this. You would have to show this to be true necessarily through demonstration. All right. So let's say, I don't know, balancing equations or something like that. Okay. So in this case, you would go through a sequence of steps in order to arrive at an answer, and that amounts to a justification. So again, this is relations of ideas because we are not using experience. You're using deduction. But the very idea of numbers and mathematics still ultimately, Hume thinks, comes from experience. Right? You're not born with mathematical ideas already in your head. All right. So in relations of ideas, this prong of the fork, so to speak, can be known with complete certainty. We can know our analytic propositions with complete certainty, such as a triangle has 3 sides, because it's true by definition. And we can know through reasoning, complex mathematical operations, we can know these with complete certainty using deduction and reason. All right. So relations of ideas, Hume thinks, can be known a priori, but only in a trivial sense. Ultimately, the foundations of knowledge are still in experience. So our understandings of numbers and so on, to begin with, come from experience. And then once we've got that, we're able to use them to perform more complex mathematical operations. Matters of fact, by contrast, can be equated with synthetic propositions, right? And all matters of fact are known a posteriori, right? Since they do not just concern relations between ideas, all right? Matters of fact show ideas are put together in the actual physical world through observation. Right? So, for example, the door is brown shows a particular way in which certain ideas are put together, and those ideas are true or false depending on whether or not the door actually is brown. Right? And it's worth pointing out that the reason that synthetic propositions are so called is because it's a synthesis of two ideas, and one adds something to the other one. Okay, in this case, the door being one idea and is brown being the other, is brown then adds something to our knowledge of the door, assuming that in reality the door actually is brown. All right? If it's not, then that proposition is false. Okay, so we have the idea of the door and the idea of brown, and in this case we can see that the idea of the door and the idea of brown have been put together in a particular combination. All right? The sense of the proposition is given by the fact that such a state of affairs is possible in real life. So in matters of fact, there is no possibility of an internal contradiction. Right? There's no possibility of an internal contradiction in a synthetic proposition, because it is always possible for us to imagine such a fact to be otherwise. Right? One can imagine it to be a falsehood. So the door might not in fact be brown, it might be green. Okay, or it might be red. There can, of course, be internal contradictions in relations of ideas. For example, a triangle has four sides is self-contradictory. Right? It's an internal contradiction. Has four sides contradicts the definition of triangle, and so contains an internal contradiction. That's not possible with a synthetic proposition. A synthetic proposition is either true or false, depending on whether that state of affairs exists or not. So it depends, for example, on whether the door is brown as to whether the proposition the door is brown is true or false. So here are just some examples of relations of ideas and matters of fact that you could use in a 25-mark question or a 12-mark question if you needed some examples to use. So we've got Pythagoras' theorem, and all bachelors are unmarried under relations of ideas. Stones fall when dropped from a height, or impact makes a snooker ball move, are matters of fact. Okay, so just have a look through those and try to memorize some of them. Now, moving on, Hume, like Locke, believes that there are no innate ideas. Right? So a bachelor, according to Hume, is an idea derived from experience. You didn't know it when you were born, you've acquired it since. Right? So a bachelor, being an unmarried male, right, is not something that you were born knowing. You've acquired the idea through experience. Right? Once you've got the idea, then you know that all bachelors are unmarried, and that's just a case of relations of ideas. But all of this does still lead to a bit of skepticism. All right, and this quote here is from Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He says, "Nothing can ever be present to the mind but an image or perception, and that the senses are only the inlets through which these images are conveyed, without being able to produce any immediate interaction between the mind and the object. The table which we see seems to diminish as we remove farther from it, but the real table, which exists independent of us, suffers no alteration. It was, therefore, nothing but its image which was present to the mind. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such a connection is, therefore, without any foundation in reasoning." And what Hume means by this is that, firstly, we interpret the experience, or rather we interpret the external world through the veil of perception, if you like. We are he is basically an indirect realist. All right, that's the first point. Hume is an indirect realist. He believes that the mind shows us the world as it is capable of so doing. All right, and he also thinks that the mind is passive. Right, that it is the external world, the mind-independent reality, that acts on the mind, right, and causes it to provide us with certain particular visual representations, for example. All right, but the problem is that there's no direct connection with the objects. All we have is how the mind represents reality to us. There's no direct connection between the mind and reality itself. And this, of course, can lead to skepticism in terms of raising the question, how do we know that how the world is represented to us is actually how the world is? So whilst Hume believes that all knowledge comes from experience, he is mindful of the problem that how we perceive the world may not be how the world actually is. So many of the ideas that we have are only as good as the reliability of our observations, right? And many of the ideas that we've come to have through this empiricist model of concept acquisition, right, are based on how the senses represent the world to us. So this is a similar objection that one can make to John Locke and indirect realism. Okay, it's essentially the same. But if secondary qualities are how our senses interpret the external world, how can we know that the ideas that we get from our experiences are the appropriate ones with which to describe the world? All right. If it's not possible to establish beyond doubt a definite and reliable connection between our senses and the external world, then we've no good reason to think that the way in which we describe the world is necessarily going to be the appropriate one. Right. So, let's just recap. Hume only attaches limited importance to a priori knowledge. Right. He thinks that once we have ideas, then we are, of course, able to combine them in particular ways independently of experience. But he doesn't think ultimately that knowledge is a priori. He thinks that fundamentally it comes from experience. All right. Relations of ideas are obviously ways in which we are able to combine the ideas that we have already acquired through experience in particular ways, and from that, perhaps through certain mathematical operations, come to find out certain further mathematical truths. Matters of fact, on the other hand, are essentially claims that are based on observation, right? So a matter of fact, for example, the light is on or the door is brown, is true if those circumstances are the case, and false if they are not. Inductive and deductive knowledge. Well, in the previous video on John Locke, I talked briefly about induction and deduction. Induction is the idea that from a finite series of observations, one forms a general principle. For example, you observe every mammal has a heart, so you come to the general principle, every mammal has a heart. Obviously, one problem with that is that it would only take one counterexample for that principle to no longer be true. That's known as the problem of induction. Deductive argument, on the other hand, is a form of argument when the conclusion necessarily follows from the two premises. So, for example, premise 1, every mammal has a heart. Premise 2, all horses are mammals. Conclusion, all horses have hearts. All right. So, when it comes to Hume's thoughts about the role of deduction and induction and the external world, he would say, well, look, we can use deduction once we have our ideas, right? But the premises of our deductive arguments essentially still have to be grounded in experience. And that, of course, does leave them vulnerable to the problem of induction. And that's the end of this video.